Jeff Sachs here from Beit Agnon for the third of our four-part series on war, writing, and remembrance. Last week, we had, I think, a very meaningful experience in looking at Bialik's poem of the Kishinev pogrom, Be'ir HaHariga, and even more so, our time together with Ilan Tron, who spoke about his family's experiences and how they resonate with that 120-year-old poem. And 2 weeks ago, we started on something a little lighter with Shalom Aleichem. I'm going to come back to Shalom Aleichem later in the talk today, because we're going to be talking something about the connection between humor and trauma and tragedy, and how these things work out, and how Shalom Aleichem did it, and how Agnon did it. Next week, we'll be looking at a much more contemporary work by Rabbi Chaim Sabato, his novel Adjusting Sights in Hebrew Tium Kavanot. It's the only text that we can't make available to you in full. So if you do want to read it, you have time to read it between now and then. It's not a terribly long novel. It's, I think, only about 180 pages or so in the translation. So you can get your hands on a copy of the book at a local library, or here in Israel, you can certainly get it probably at any Steinmetzky, or order through the publisher, and those abroad can certainly order it through Amazon. Tonight's text, Agnon's introduction to the Kaddish, is available at the link in the chat and will be displayed on the screen in the translation. Pticha Kaddish is really unique in the canon of Agnon's writings. It's not fiction. It's not liturgy. It's not literature in the conventional sense. It's liturgy. It's composed as a prayer. It's composed as an introduction, a pticha, to the recitation of the Mourner's Kaddish. It's a text that was published in 1947, about a half a year before the establishment of the state, and follows a medieval tradition of the paitanim, of the Hebrew liturgical poets, who would write thematic expansions of the tefillot. So those of you that are familiar with the Siddur, certainly are aware of some of these things, whether you know it by that name. So, for example, on Shabbat morning, in most synagogues, we sing the piyut Keladon. Keladon al kol hamasim baruch b'fi kol shama. It's a piyut, a poem that's sung to a variety of tunes as part of the brachot of Shema. On Shabbat, when you have more time and the tefillah takes a more leisurely pace, we add things to the normal brachot that are recited before and after the recitation of Shema in the morning. And that Keladon is one of them. It's an acrostic poem. That's a pticha of sorts, meaning it takes one of the themes of the prayer and it kind of expands it and it deepens it through the poetic medium. And Agnon's introduction to the Kaddish was composed in that style as a way of ushering in the recitation of the Mourner's Kaddish, and specifically the Mourner's Kaddish Achar Mitatam Shel Harugei Eretz Yisrael, following the bier, the coffin of those who have been killed on behalf of Eretz Yisrael. Here he uses the term the land of Israel, because it was authored, in fact, before the establishment of Medinat Yisrael. And this poetic prayer expansion really did enter the modern liturgy of the state of Israel, and is recited. Probably most of us have participated. Certainly those of us that are here in Israel have participated in Tekes Yom HaZikaron, a Memorial Day service here in the country, where the recitation of Agnon's piece is part of the service. In the Hebrew book Samuch V'Nireh, which is a collection of different short stories of a variety of types. The text is printed at the very, very end. In Samuch V'Nireh, which contains a variety of works, including works that we've studied together, like Agnon's Shnei Talmidei Chachamim Shayu B'Irenu, two scholars who were in a town, a story that I've taught, I know many of you, in different settings, in different places, and his collection Sefer HaMa'asim, his collection of 20 short, somewhat surrealistic stories, his modernistic tales, the stories for which he was often compared, much to his chagrin, to Kafka, comes a set of 4 or 5 short pieces called the Prakim Mitoch Sefer HaMedina, the Prakim Shel Sefer HaMedina, the stories of the Book of State. And these are short satirical works about politics. They're political satires. And when they were translated and published in English, we put them out in this volume called The Orange Peel and Other Satires. Orange Peel being perhaps the best known of this collection of political satires, and it became the title story of our English collection. And these are stories, you may be familiar with some of them. The title story, The Orange Peel, goes something like this. Somebody tosses an orange peel in the middle of the city. Now, like most political satires, if you remember your Jonathan Swift from when you were a high school student, political satire is rarely set directly in the place that it's satirizing. Jonathan's Gulliver's Travels was not about England of its day. It was about a place called Lilliput. But of course, you didn't need some kind of decoder ring to decipher the meaning and the object of his wit and his satire. The satirists, particularly political satire, the satirist's goal is to amuse, but to also arouse the ire of his readers against the whatever it is, whichever societal vices and shortcomings and political flaws of the society that he's trying to ridicule. And usually political satire has some kind of didactic goal, some type of remedial agenda. It's trying to advance some kind of better idea of how society or the body politic could be governed. Because of this, it really is an unusual genre for Agnon. Very often you may recall me saying a sentence something like, Agnon's stories, even when they're mining the wealth of rabbinic literature and are interplaying and doing the intertextual work with the Jewish bookshelf, he's not writing the Guide for the Perplexed or the Mesilat Yesharim. He's not trying to be didactic. Agnon's first goal as an artist was always aesthetic, to create a great work of literature. But political satire can't only do that. It has to be making a point, and often it has to be making it very sharply right on the nose. And he does engage in it, but it's a minor genre in his canon. When Agnon was being humorous, usually he was being an ironist, not a satirist. But nevertheless, this section of political satires, it really is quite interesting because it shows how he's responding to events of his day. Now, these satires of the state were authored, as a matter of fact, many of them were authored before the establishment of the state. And they cover all types of things, wide ranges from everything from taxes to trash collecting to the windbaggery and pompousness of political leaders. In one of the stories, Shlom Olamim, in English it's translated as Peace Everlasting, he gives up an almost Dr. Seussian version of the problems of secular religious divide in the soon to be established state of Israel. And sadly, until the last few weeks, not much has changed. Right now, we're in a period of great unity secular, religious, Haredi, secular. Everybody's getting along, at least for the time being. And, maybe we can hope it'll continue. But if you remember Dr. Seuss's Sneetches about these different types of creatures, some are born with little green stars on their bellies and some aren't. It was meant as an allegory for racism. So Agnon gives us in Shlomo Lamin something similar, but instead of being born with stars on your belly or not, some people are head coverers and some people are not head coverers, and that's the object. He doesn't call them religious and secular, you understand, but the allegory is quite clear. Later, Agnon said in a work called Agnon has this work called there's this book that was put out after Agnon died called Shai Agnon Ba'al Peh, a collection of maisalach, a collection of little anecdotes about Agnon, or the wit and wisdom of Agnon as told to his friend David Knaani. Agnon had this friend who was a journalist and a writer, and after Agnon died, he published this short little volume of the wit and wisdom of Agnon. You can often find them. It's out of print, but you can often find them in the used bookstores. If you find one, should get one. It's full of all the great anecdotes about Agnon. But in passing, Agnon says here in Hebrew, I regret that I ever published these satirical stories about the state. We don't know exactly when he says this. It's one of the flaws in Knaani's book that he records all these things he heard from Agnon over the years, but he doesn't tell us exactly when Agnon said them. But it sounds like something he might have said later in life, in the 50s and the 60s, about these stories that he wrote in the early and late 40s. He says, I regret that I wrote it. Et Sefer Medina lo ashlim. I won't complete the work. I won't add more stories to that collection, these satires of the state. And then he wrote Selevaker et Medina. I don't wish to criticize the state. Yesh lanu a Medinale, ko rabim oiveha. We have just one tiny little state, a Medinale. We don't even have like a whole Medina, a whole state. We have like a little statelet, using this Yiddish diminutive, a Medinale. Ko rabim oiveha, with so many enemies standing against us. V'tzarich lishmor aleha. We have to guard it. We have to take care of it. So he came to feel ambivalent about these stories. But in all of the stories and all of the satires, I should say, there's one common theme. And that's the idea that as the state, as sovereignty became everything here in the land of Israel, the individual was marginalized. That in the tension between nation building and the individual to stand alone against the state and to maintain his or her own identity, when so much emphasis was placed on the collective, from the artist's perspective, that's a fascinating topic. And from Agnon's perspective, even though Agnon himself was a Zionist, he would probably even have considered himself a religious Zionist. Nevertheless, he had some ambivalence about this change in Jewish existence, which shifted everything so much to the state and to its institutions, which comes with a lot of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is a very easy thing to satirize. When for 2,000 years, the biggest thing that the Jewish people had ever organized was Kaddish, was the affairs of a small Jewish town. And suddenly to go and to manage the affairs of an entire nation with an education system, with a sanitation system, with an army, and with the need to get it right. Well, that is a transformational experience, maybe an unprecedented experience in the history of nations. And the consequences, of course, are so much bigger. Now, if this we see in Shalom Aleichem, the ability to satirize the smallness of Jewish life in the diaspora, right? Um, think of that opening scene in Fiddler on the Roof, which is drawn from the source material in the Tevye stories. The opening scene in Fiddler on the Roof, where you meet all of the different characters, the Shadchan and the Yenta and the Schnorrer and the Rabbi and the right. In other words, the people come to the Rabbi and say, "Rabbi, is there a proper blessing for the Tsar?" And the Rabbi says, "May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from us." So we get the humor, but that's a very distinctly galut humor. It's humor of the diaspora about a very distinctly galut phenomena. But here, I mean, we've seen in the last 2 months what the consequences of having a government and getting it right, or God forbid, getting it wrong are. In 1964, Agnon was interviewed. There was a journalist here by the name of Geula Cohen. She had been an underground radio broadcaster for the Etzel during the Yom Ha'atzmaut, during the Milchemet Ha'atzmaut, and then she had been a longtime reporter for Ma'ariv, and then later she went into politics and became a very right-wing politician, here in Israel in the 70s and the 80s. But in the 60s, she had a column in Ma'ariv where she interviewed, let's say, public officials or public figures about the events of the day. And she would write it up and publish it. And Agnon was interviewed a handful of times over the years in her column. And in the 60s, it's not clear to me why Dafka at that time she was asking this question. She interviews Agnon about the army, about what was then perceived to be a kind of growing cult of power in the country around the army. I've recently translated this little interview, and it's meant to appear in the next issue of the Jewish Review of Books, so you can look out for it there. But Agnon says something very interesting. He says, he's got all high regard for the army, and particularly the idea. This is rather late in Agnon's life, but particularly he's got high regard for the sacrifices that people make to maintain the Jewishness of the army. On one hand, he's talking about religious observance, but on the other hand, he's talking about the idea that to have an army in Medinat Yisrael means that the army has to be imbued with a certain type of Jewishness, because otherwise, how will we know what we're fighting for? How will we maintain our values as a military if we should just become an army like any other nation? But then he strikes a kind of cautionary note, and he says, sometimes I worry that after 2,000 years of not picking up the sword, because that was the reality of the diaspora, after 2,000 years of not picking up the sword, if we shouldn't return to it with a kind of heightened vigor or heightened appetite, meaning that we should pick up the sword when we need to in defense. We shouldn't become saber rattlers. It says a lot about him. It says a lot about his generation. We can talk about it on a different occasion. But these are some of the concerns that he has when he's thinking about things related to the state. But in 1947, he sets the satire aside. And what's fascinating about this piece we're looking at tonight is that it's appended to the political satires. There is not a satirical note in the piece at all. I think there may be a desire, the organization of the book in this way, where you have these political satires, where he's making fun of just mercilessly making fun of life in the state. The title story, The Orange Peel, is that there's an orange peel dropped in the middle of the street. In the middle, I was saying that it's, we talk about it as a Lilliput. It's not clear that it's Jerusalem, but it's obvious that it's the intersection of King George and Yafo, which once upon a time was the center of the world here at least in Yerushalayim. At one time, that intersection of King George and Yaffa, where the old timers will remember, it was the intersection where you used to be able to cross on an X. You could cross diagonally across the street before they put in the light rail. That was the only traffic light in Yerushalayim. Rabbi Chaim Bravender tells a story that back in the 60s, people would go on dates to that corner to watch the traffic light change. Jerusalem was a very boring city, and that's what that was considered an exciting night out to go watch the traffic light change. So somebody has dropped an orange peel. Now, if this was Charlie Chaplin or the Three Stooges or some other slapstick, of course, it would be a banana peel. But here in the what could be more, what could be a better symbol of the Zionist enterprise than the peel of a Jaffa orange? And somebody slips on the orange peel and somebody else tumbles over that person until Chad Gadya, all of Jerusalem is backed up, for want of somebody to clean the street, because one person tripped over another person, until the whole city comes to a standstill. When along comes one individual, one yachid, one sole person against the chaos, the narrator of the story, who we are meant to believe is Agnon himself, who says, I will go and I will pick up the orange peel so that people can get back on their feet and get moving along. And he does that. And along come two police officers and says, pardon me, sir, who do you think you are? Do you have a license to collect garbage in this city? We're going to have to take you down to the station, etc., etc. You can understand the satire of Israeli bureaucracy. By appending a very serious work, there is a tradition. I understand that I don't have a source for this, but I had understood from somebody somebody asks if we can make the Hebrew available. We can't make the Hebrew text available because of copyright problems. If you contact me directly, I can send it to you. But if you Google Pticha Agnon, Pticha Kaddish, you are likely to find it online, and then somebody else is in copyright trouble. There is a tradition, as I understand it, it's a tradition in Italian literature. Political satire is a very highly developed form in Italy, because there's more to satirize there than even here. They've had, every 6 months they get a new government. But there's a tradition that after you write a series of satires, you conclude the series with a serious piece, as if to make sure that the reader doesn't misunderstand what you were saying, as if to really put a fine point on the real didactic aspect. So the placement of this introduction to the Kaddish after those satires, the works are in conversation with each other, as we'll see. And this is how it begins in English. Well, let me just read for you the Hebrew. And even if you don't understand the Hebrew, you can understand the rhythm of how not only poetic, but prayerful it is. It reads like a combination of something from the Sidur and a Midrash. Sometimes it's printed in the standard edition, it's printed in block text. You can find some versions of it where it's laid out like poetry. And in our English edition, there are multiple translations. In our English edition, it's laid out like lines of poetry, although it's not rhymed poetry. But in Hebrew, Melech basar v'dam shiyotzei lemilchama al oevav motzi chaylotav leharog uleheraeg. A king of flesh and blood, who goes out to war against his enemies, brings forth his force to kill and to be killed. Laharog uleheraeg. You may hear the echo here. Laharog lahareg. I identify the old Zionist trope, livnot ulehibanot, that the Zionist cause was to build the land and for the builders to be upbuilt by the work. But here it's a grotesque inversion. War is the opposite. Soldiers are sent out to kill and to be killed. There is doubt whether he, the king of flesh and blood, loves his soldiers or whether he does not love his soldiers, whether they are important in his eyes or whether they are not important in his eyes. And even if they are important in his eyes, they are no more important than corpses, because the angel of death follows upon their heel to slay them. And if one is struck down by a blade or a bullet or another means of destruction and killed, another is set in his place, and the king ignores his loss. Now, not to be cynical, but this is the way it is with war. I mean, no doubt the politicians understand the weight of their responsibilities. We hope that they do. And no doubt when soldiers are killed, they make appropriate statements. Publicly, privately, they grieve with the mourning families, but they understand that that's the nature of war. Somewhere in the Pentagon and somewhere here in the Kiryat, in the military headquarters, there's an office. I presume it's in a basement. I presume there's a little plaque in front of the office that has a name that's some highly euphemized description of what actually happens in that office. But in that office are statisticians and actuaries and military planners who figure out the cost of war, who figure out that if we do this operation against that enemy in the following place, we are likely to lose X number of planes and Y number of tanks and Z number of soldiers. It's horrific. I wouldn't want that job. But it's the most necessary thing for an army to have. Without it, there is no way for an army to responsibly, for a government to responsibly exercise military power without having that information. And I presume that the people that do that job, within a small standard deviation of error, have a pretty good sense of what the cost in human life is. And when the war cabinet is deciding, when they're sitting down there in the, what do they call that in the White House? The Situation Room, right? I don't know, who knows what it really looks like, but we have a really good sense of what it must be like just from watching it on TV. I'm sure in reality, it's quite different. When they're making those decisions, they know very well, we're going to do this, and X number of soldiers are likely not to return. It's horrific. But without knowing those consequences, how could they possibly undertake that decision-making? And then to be able to say, va'af al pichen, and nevertheless, we have to do this operation. So Agnon's depiction of the Melech Basar V'Dam is that this takes place, and even if there's an understanding of what the cost is, that's the cost of doing business. There's this sense of that's the cost of doing business, and we must do it. And if one soldier falls, we have another one, we replace him. Just like if a tank is destroyed, we have another one, we replace it. I should say that this was first published on Erev, it was in the Haaretz newspaper, on Erev Yom Kippur Tafshin Chet. That means Erev Yom Kippur, 1947. A few weeks before Kaftet Ben, yesterday was Kaftet Ben November. Yesterday was the anniversary of the 1947 UN decision for the partition plan, the 29th of November. So this was a few weeks before. Things had already gotten bad, and they would get increasingly worse until the outbreak of the war and the establishment of the state in May of 48. Jews were already being killed, clashes with Arab rioters, clashes with the forces of the British Mandate. And there's a sense that there's a real human cost here to what we're attempting to do, in the land of Israel. There's going to be a real human cost here to establishing a state. And that is not how we envision it. The description here of the king of flesh and blood is not what we aspire to. Rather, will I move this? I'm sorry. Okay. For the nations of the world are great in number, and their armies are great in number. And if one of them is killed, the king has many to replace him. But our king, the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, desires life, loves peace, pursues peace, loves Israel, his people, and has chosen us from all the nations, not because we are great in number, for we are the least in number. Now, very many of these phrases are lifted from, well, directly from the Bible or from the other holy literature. Someone in the comment has been annotating as we go along. But unlike Agnon's writings that we're used to, which are this kind of pastiche of references to the Jewish bookshelf and to the holy canon and to the rabbinic texts, where Agnon is kind of putting things together to be very often ironically or subversively in dialogue with those texts. Here he's doing it in order to compose liturgy. There's no irony here. There's no subversion of the holy texts. So when he says, not because we are great in number, right? A verse in the book of Deuteronomy, we are the least in number because he loves us and we are few in number. Each one of us, as important as his eyes, is a whole regiment. For he does not have many to set in our place. Thus, if one Jew dies, God forbid, distress falls upon the regiments of the king. And a weakening comes to the kingdom of he who is blessed. For his kingdom lacks one of its regiments, and the greatness of he who is blessed is lessened. This is a very profound theological statement. It's one that some readers of this text could not take seriously. Readers who probably could not fully understand the depth of the religious meaning of that particular moment in 1947-48, the particular religious meaning of what it meant for those people in that generation, some of whom walked straight out of Auschwitz to the Holy Land to try to build a Jewish state, what that meant for them. People thought Agnon, there were some readers, a minority, but there were some who thought that he was being sarcastic here by putting such phraseology, making such descriptions of God's state of mind. But what is he saying here? He says each soldier in the army of Israel is as precious to God as an entire regiment. And if one falls, it's true, we don't have many. If you're, how did Russia win? Why should you never fight a land war in Asia? Why should you never fight a war against Russia? How is it possible that what was Hitler thinking in turning on Russia? Like in Russia, where you had a Stalin who couldn't care less. I mean, there's no sense of public opinion, right? In other words, here we have a problem. In America, there's a problem. Putin doesn't yet have this problem. Right now, people are behind the war, whether people like Netanyahu or don't like Netanyahu. The nation, almost to a man, is in support of the war. At a certain point, that begins to turn. Some of you remember the war in Lebanon, the first war in Lebanon. In the beginning of that war, there was support as well. Some people remember Vietnam. Right? That was something which was never popular and ultimately failed because it lost popular support. A government in a democracy, a government can only keep it up so long while the people are against them. So that's not the issue here. The issue isn't just numbers. It's not just a game of numbers, that we don't have many people. And at a certain point, the casualties are going to mount up and people are only willing to suffer. In Russia, 17, how many people, how many millions died in Russia in World War II? 17 million, I think, something like that. Somebody can Google check me and fact check me as we're going along. Because Stalin, there were always more Russians. It's a really big country. And you tell these guys out on some farm in the middle of Siberia, show up for work tomorrow. You're going off to be a soldier on the front. They don't have a choice. And you like cannon fodder. You can just keep throwing more Russian soldiers at the German front. That may have been what Agnon has in mind here when he's talking about a melech basar v'dam, a king of flesh and blood. He might have been thinking of Stalin, right? Or the like. But God and the Jewish people, it's not like that. But it's not only because of function of numbers. This numbers game is very dangerous. It minimizes suffering. This whole conversation, where there's a trauma and a tragedy and a massacre, and we pull out the tape measure to figure out, is it better or worse than 9/11? Is it bigger or lesser than how many, like last week, how many Kishynevs was it, right? One measure of Kishinev is 49 dead. So how many Kishynevs was October 7th, right? And of course, the ultimate yardstick, where does it rank relative to the Shoah? So that's partially a function of numbers, how many people are actually killed. And then we do the math and we figure out the percentages of, as a per capita, 1,200 people killed in our little state. Is that more than Pearl Harbor or less than Pearl Harbor? Is that more relative to national population than 9/11 or less than? But what Agnon is saying here is that it doesn't matter because each one person is infinity. And you know what 49 times infinity is? You know what 49 Kishinev infinities is? It's infinity. And you know what 1,200 October 7th infinities is? It's infinity. And you know what 6 million Kaddoshim in the Holocaust is? It's times is infinity, right? So on a certain plane, if you're the Ramatkal, if you're the chief of staff of the army, you need to know the details and the statistics and the numbers and the costs. But from a heavenly perspective, each and every person is a world unto himself. Hidden between the lines here is the expression in the Gemara that each life is a world unto itself, and each death is the destruction of a destruction of a whole world. So when each and every soldier is killed, and as it were, an entire regiment or an entire world or infinity is lost, it's not just a loss for that soldier, and it's not just a loss for his platoon, and it's not just a loss for his family. God himself suffers a loss because something unique has been damaged in creation. Distress falls upon the regiments of the king, and a weakening comes to the kingdom. And it's not just that God's kingdom is weakened because it has one less soldier, but he himself is damaged. Now, I'll use a word that we use in Hebrew, kavayochel. Kavayochel literally means as if it were. Kavayochel is a word that we use when we don't know what we're talking about. We say something about God that we don't really understand, or we anthropomorphize his emotions and feelings, and we say kaviyachol, as if it were, as if we could talk about him the way we talk about ourselves. So for pious purposes, I'll throw that in. But Agnon is saying when each and every soldier is lost, when any soldier is lost, God's kingdom is lessened, which means God is lessened. Therefore, and that's the reason that we say Kaddish. Now, Kaddish is this funny thing. People have funny relationships to Kaddish. The old joke. I grew up in a shul in suburban New Jersey. A little shul. It's much different today, thank God. This is in Linden, New Jersey. Today it's much different. It's a thriving community. But when I was a kid growing up in this Orthodox shul with a largely non-observant population, made up almost exclusively of what I thought at the time, I thought they were all old men. They were probably my age now, but although some of them really were quite old men. And that shul maintained a daily minyan in the morning by the skin of its teeth. It was a minyan, I think, that started at 6 a.m. And on Mondays and Thursdays, it started at 10 to 6. And on Rosh Chodesh, it started at 20 to 6. And, in the winter, it's dark and cold at that hour. And they held on to that daily minyan by the skin of their teeth. Sometimes they had only 10 men, 11 men. And it was only because a lot of these old guys, well, there was two reasons. Every morning after davening, there was this bottle of wild turkey that magically appeared, and they'd have a l'chaim. But it was mostly because those people were saying Kaddish, right? Everybody was always saying Kaddish for somebody they had lost, or it was a yahrzeit, or it was a year of mourning, or something like that. And when you'd finished your year of mourning, you kept up your minyan routine because you felt an obligation to the 9 other men that still needed it. And that pull of Kaddish, people whose religious commitments, many people's religious commitments were not so solid. Not all of these people. Like, can you imagine people making that sacrifice to get up at whatever ungodly hour in the morning, in the cold, in the dark, to make a minyan in a small Jewish community because of this commitment to Kaddish? So the joke always was, that's why Kaddish is recited in Aramaic, because in Aramaic nobody knows what they're saying. They assume what does the Kaddish talk about? So these people assume Yiskadal v'Yiskadash Shemei Rabbah. May the soul of my dead father rise higher and higher. Let my mother look down from heaven and guard and protect me and my children. That's what people imagine the prayer for the dead, the mourner's prayer must be. But those of you, of course, that know what the Kaddish means, no, it's not about that at all. Kaddish doesn't refer to death or the dead or the dying at all. I mean, the joke doesn't work because the fact that it's in Aramaic, so they didn't understand it. Had it been written in Hebrew, they probably also wouldn't have understood it. And they all, of course, had access to in that day, the Birnbaum Siddur with a translation. But the idea that the mystical pull of the Kaddish. So who are we saying Kaddish for? It's not for the Mame, and it's not for the Tate. It's not for the dead who've gone on. It's for God. Therefore, because of what we said in the last paragraph, therefore we pray after the death of each Jew, Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. May the power of God's name be magnified, and may no lessening of power come to him who is blessed and sanctified. Bi'alma divrach hirutei, in the worlds he has created according to his will. What does it mean that God is the infinite great? God is the infinite power. What does it mean to add one more drop of greatness to infinity? To say Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. In what way has God's name become not kadosh? When we say Yitgadal v'yitkadash, v'yitkadash, that God's name should become sanctified, right? It's already sanctified. What can I add by? So apparently, Agnon is reading into the Kaddish the idea that with death comes a lessening of God himself. That's why there's a radical theology playing out here. And let us not be in fear of ourselves, but for the glory of his holiness. V'yamlich malchutei. May his kingdom rule. May it be revealed. And may you see his kingdom in its fullness, lacking nothing. God forbid. If his kingdom is revealed in the world, then there is peace in the world, and blessing in the world, and song in the world. You see, in other words, you see the transliterated phrases here are how the text of the Kaddish itself is interwoven into Agnon's interstitial expansions or commentary. That there's peace in the world and blessing in the world and song in the world and much rejoicing in the world and great consolation in the world. And the holy ones of Israel are beloved in the world. And his greatness continues to be magnified and expanded and not diminished. Le'olam, forever. And if we pray thus for each one who dies, right? All of that is relative, for any Jew. But there's something else happening. How much more so for our dear, and this is why this text, all of the texts that we're studying in these 4 weeks, these were all, the curriculum was chosen because these were the 4 things that jumped off the shelf to me in the days following October 7th. Bialik came to me immediately. Shalom Aleicham's Simchas Torah story came to me the next morning when I saw those unused. You remember 2 weeks ago, I told you that story about Hemingway, for sale, baby shoes never worn. And the next day I go and I see the Simchas Torah flags still wrapped up in their wrapper, unused. And I thought, for sale, Simchas Torah flags never waved. So yesterday I saw this little girl that came out, the hostage that was released yesterday. What's her name? Abigail. I forget the last name. She came out, and while she was in, like little kids, 5-6 years old, they lose, there's that period where they have no front teeth because they're missing their teeth. So she had lost her front teeth while she was in captivity, and I assume the tooth fairy didn't make it to Gaza. So there was this picture of her hugging whichever family member with her broad smile, and her front teeth are missing. And the caption was, her teeth fell out in captivity. And I thought, oh my God, that's it. That's the 6 words. That's the Hemingway novel about this. What does it mean to say all of what was Hemingway saying in that micro fiction? For sale, baby shoes never worn. I mean, if you weren't with us in the session when we did Shalom Aleichem, you can go back to the recording. In that line, in those 6 words, is a tip of an iceberg. The entirety of human tragedy and existence are hidden in those 6 words. How much more so, her teeth fell out in captivity, right? That this little girl lost her first tooth while God knows where she was. So here, this text jumped out at me during October 7th, during October 8th, during those days. And we pray thus for each one who dies, how much more so for our dear brothers and sisters, the children of Zion, the slaughtered ones of the land of Israel, whose blood was spilled for the glory of his name and for his people and for his land and for his inheritance. If we say this Kaddish, if we're conscious that the loss of every single Jew lessens God's kingdom on earth, how much more so for those who have fallen in the defense of his name. In other words, it's a complete reworking. It's a complete reworking of the Kaddish. It forestalls the question of the idea, if each Jew is on guard in the service of the king, what does it mean that we sometimes experience the world as if the king has abandoned his post. Well, when that happens, he himself is damaged. He himself is lessened. And this introduction to the Kaddish is offering an answer back up to heaven. We suffer down here. We were massacred. And we know that that causes massacre in heaven. That causes a lessening in heaven. And if God is lessened, we have to pray that he should be Yitgadal. He should be made great again. He should be restored to his former state, which means, of course, that we're really praying for ourselves. It's a two-way street. It's a mirror. Further, every dweller in the land of Israel is one of the company of the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, whom the king has appointed as a guard of his palace. If one of his company is killed, he does not have others to set in his place. Therefore, O our brethren, the whole house of Israel, who mourn in this morning, we turn our hearts to our Father in heaven, the King of Israel and its Redeemer, and we pray for ourselves and for him. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei rabah, v'yalma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'yatzmach v'karev mishichei. May the Messiah come speedily and soon, that we may be worthy to live and see with our very eyes. Oseh shalom bimromav. First, he has to make peace in heaven. And when there'll be peace in heaven, then there can be peace on earth. That he who in his mercies makes peace in the heavens will make peace for us. Hu yaseh shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. And that's Agnon's Pticha Kaddish. But you see how this most serious of all of the texts that he wrote, and he wrote some very serious texts. Remember, most of his works, his greatest genre is the tragic genre. Think of some of the great stories we've read together. And even in the tragic genres, he knew how to balance. He knew how to keep the reader going. He knew how to the need for comic relief in order to keep a plot moving. But even in his most tragic works, we don't see anything like this. Right? That the need for the individual to find his place in a world where the collective is everything. And what could be more emblematic of a nation's emphasis on the collective than an army? This of all of the achievements of the Yishuv and the establishment of the state, there can be none that rivals the army. I mean, the Jewish people came back and we reawakened our old language and made it new again. Dayenu. What a cultural achievement. And we created with that language a university, the Hebrew university, right? Dayenu. And we paved roads, and we drained swamps, and we built bridges and institutions, and we brought back Jews from all over the world and settled them. You know, this whole question of refugees, everywhere in the world. Think of what our country achieved in terms of, now it's not exactly the same as taking in refugees from a faraway country that your country has nothing to do with. But just think of what that meant to resettle Jews from Yemen and Iraq, and Jews from Romania and Poland, and Jews, even some Americans. Right? Not enough. And you know what that meant to create a society of immigrants, you know, and even when we didn't get it, even when we didn't do it perfectly, but we did it, right? It's remarkable. And of all of the achievements, founding a democracy, the only democracy in a neighborhood not so sympathetic to democracy, of all the achievements, the idea that we have a Jewish army defending the Jewish state and the Jewish people, and trying to do so according to, informed by Jewish values. I mean, forget the technicalities that it's a Jewish army where, at least in principle, if not in always in practice, it's a Jewish army that observes the Sabbath, even though the majority of soldiers are not Sabbath observant. But the army as an institution observes the Sabbath, asterisk, except for when it can't, except for in ways that it's not possible. And even then, that's also Sabbath observance, right? When you violate the Sabbath in the defense of life, that's observing the Sabbath. That it's an army where the whole army is kosher, right? Now, I'm not saying that there was never, a mix-up in some army kitchen. God knows that was the case. But in principle, the whole army is kosher. This was one of the beautiful things we saw. These non-kosher eateries in Tel Aviv that went kosher, like in the early days of the war, when just the logistics of making everything happen and getting food to everybody, non-kosher restaurants in Tel Aviv were going kosher for, temporarily, right? In order to prepare meals to be sent to soldiers in the army, soldiers who themselves don't keep kosher, right? But when you're a soldier in the army, you eat kosher. The food that's provided to you is kosher, right? But even more so, more than all of that, the idea that it's an army that aspires to a set of values, that are Jewish, that tries to establish its code of ethics based on Torah and Jewish values. That may be the most remarkable achievement of all, and perhaps the most difficult, and really perhaps the most difficult. So when one of those people is lost, a world is lost, and heaven is diminished. But the tension between the collective, that's necessary. What is army if not collective? Everybody knows exactly which cog he is in this big machine and which cog is above him. And right there on your lapels or your epaulets, right, you wear a little symbol that tells you and everybody else where you fit in as which piece of the cog you are. And the army has to move together and work together and march together. That's what armies are. That's what armies do. But that comes at a great cost. The other great Jewish value of the sanctity and uniqueness of each and every individual. So what plays out for slapstick in the satirical stories, right, here is turned into the most profound and serious theological reflection of each person as a world unto himself. And when he is lost in the service of the king, when he is lost in defending the palace of the king, which is the land and state of Israel, the king himself is lessened. And therefore we mourn that person by mourning God. And that's what Agnon's reflection in the Sefer Medina and in the introduction to the Kaddish, and in fact, in the earlier part of the volume, the earlier part of Samuch V'Nireh, all of those stories about those surrealistic stories, they're also dealing with the same thing. They're all in that Kafkaesque kind of way, the individual against the bureaucracy, the individual being ground under the wheels of something bigger than him, not always understanding the forces that are at work on him. So in some ways, the whole work is put together. And this was observed years ago by Professor Aleph Orbach, the great Talmudist, the great halachist, Professor Orbach, who was a close friend of Agnon, and wrote a very trenchant essay on this particular topic. It's only available in Hebrew, but if you're interested, you can contact me and I can send that to you. But it's also important, this discussion of the sanctity of each individual and what the cost of the loss of every life is, because this was written in 1947. The tally of the 6 million was not yet complete. It was still being undertaken. And the human sacrifices that were being made daily on behalf of this fledgling state, were really beginning to mount. So Agnon's introduction to the Kaddish is composed in answer to the question of what does it mean to salvage the religious metaphors of serving and standing guard in the palace of the king, in the Holy Land, at a time when many were asking, where's the king? And has he abandoned his troops? That is a very weighty question. And Agnon's response is embodied satirically elsewhere, but liturgically and quite seriously here in the introduction to the Kaddish. Next week, we'll look at really one of the most important pieces of writing on the themes that we've been talking about, and that is of Sabbato's adjusting sites, Tium Kavanot.